25 years ago, two men embarked on a thrilling and potentially treacherous adventure that would change the face of hockey. The first man was Don Luce, the Buffalo Sabres Director of Player Development, and the second man was me. My name is Jerry Meehan, and in 1989, I was the general manager of the Buffalo Sabres when I directed and participated in the defection of Alexander Mogilny from the Soviet Union to the United States.
Do you remember when Alex Mogilny went to Buffalo at the end of the tournament?
Yes, of course.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
No.
"1989 was a time of great political change. The Iron Curtain was showing signs of weakness.
The wall had not come down. Things were still pretty dicey at that time.
All these politicians were speaking about democracy and so on, and nobody was serious about economy, and the economy was in terrible situation.
Soviet Union was about to crumble, but on the ice it was business as usual. The Big Red Machine captured nearly every world championship and Olympic gold from 1963 to 1989. The late Viktor Tikhonov was the head coach of the Red Army and Soviet national teams and was known for his dictatorial coaching style.
We trained 11 months out of 12, especially the young guys. It was a very hard system that you gotta go through. A lot of people came in, but not many survived.
Siva Kukushkin was a journalist, part-time translator, and a full-time confidant of Tikhonov.
What is better, to be a little bit dictator and to get result, or to have wild democracy?
I was fight for my rights. I was fight for the freedom, democracy.
Sometimes you have nightmares. That kind of work really take a lot out of you.
At that time, the Soviet presence in the NHL was minimal. Legends who were thought to be past their prime would soon be on their way.
Our players, they knew that they are as good as NHL stars, and some of them a little bit better.
The Soviets were confident they had a group of young phenoms waiting in the wings.
Mogilny to Fedorov. Fedorov back to Mogilny, scores!
Alexander Mogilny was their prize jewel. The hockey world took notice in 1988, his draft year.
In '88, I went over to Moscow for the World Junior Championships. Alex was playing at that time, and that's where we first saw him. You know, he was a dominant player.
At that point, no hockey player had ever defected from the Soviet Union. I told some people that I thought he was probably the best player in the world in that draft that year.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No question about it. I think the biggest thing was that, you know, he was playing in Russia.
All the NHL scouts here are certainly drooling over Mogilny, but don't think he's going to be picked by anybody in June.
At the draft table, I said, all right, we've got this second pick in the 5th round. What are we going to do with it? And everybody else was throwing a player at me and thinking, I said, no, we're taking Mogilny. So I didn't view it as much of a gamble, but I think a lot of people thought it was a huge gamble. January 1989, I sent Don Luce to the World Junior Tournament in Anchorage, Alaska, to introduce himself to Mogilny.
Excellent move! Scores! Oh, what a beautiful move by Mogilny!
We saw Alex walking with a couple of teammates, and I went up to him and introduced myself and told him that we had drafted him. I gave him my business card and said, Alex, you know, we drafted you. This is a team that, you know, if you ever want to know anything about our organization or anything, just give us a call.
This young man, the most talked about performer here.
5 months later, Mogilny and the Soviets captured the 1989 World Championship. The very next day, Don received an unexpected phone call that would change the future of our organization.
I got a call saying that Alex wanted to come out and come over and play in North America.
So you call me, I call Seymour Knox, the owner, and we agree that it's worth a flight to Stockholm to find out if this is the real thing. Ben Farrow was the district director of the Immigration and Naturalization Service for Western New York in 1989.
My secretary got a call from Craig Ramsey, who was with the Sabres at the time, and he came in very excited and said, we got a problem, we need your help. And they were meeting with one of the players who was on the Red Army team and had made arrangements to bring back this Alex Mogilny. And it sounded very complex, and I said, look, I'm on my way out to a meeting, but because Craig was a neighbor of mine, lived down the street, I said, why don't you stop up tonight after 8 o'clock?
And now we're suddenly talking about a Russian defector, someone that wanted to get out and come over here.
It was one I hadn't faced in the past, and one that I know Jerry and Don Luce hadn't faced in the past, and it was bigger than all of us realized.
May 3rd, Don and I landed in Stockholm around 11 a.m. Our first priority was to set up a meeting with Mogilny. We had arranged to meet with him and his representatives that evening, but they arrived at our hotel unexpectedly and asked to see us then because apparently there was some kind of a team meeting for the Soviet national team. First things first, is this Alexander Mogilny? And I thought it was from the pictures, but I'd never seen him face to face. So Don says, no, that's Alex. Mogilny was with a man named Sergei Fomichev, who was acting as his translator and representative. And we were scheduled to meet them both again at an apartment later that evening. Sergei called and said they thought they had been identified and were being followed. And they didn't want to take a chance on leading us to the apartment, so they would meet us at this mall, which was about 5 minutes away.
All of a sudden the door bursts open and Sergei and Alex come running out and jump in the car, and then we take off. They had actually snatched him away from the Soviet team.
I knew that we were into something that we really had to be concerned about.
We started making plans to get to a different hotel and start negotiating about coming to North America. I knew that wasn't going to go over well with the Soviets. In fact, Jerry admitted he felt he was being followed by the Soviets.
This is basically the point of no return. You've done it now. You made your decision. You can still go back, I think. You knew a little bit of English. No, I go. And Alexander and Sergei were processed. I kept detailed notes while I was in Sweden because I knew I would have to answer for my actions. Aside from a few colleagues, these notes have never been seen. I said we must go to the U.S. Embassy to make arrangements for the appropriate travel documents. Our next stop was the U.S. Embassy. Don dropped me off that night to get started on the paperwork. We knew darn well that U.S. embassies are watched by people who might have contrary interests. Ben Farrow had stated on the phone he would talk to the State Department in Washington, D.C. to get direction.
We did have the embassy in Stockholm working with us and with headquarters to get a piece of paper, a document that gave them permission to board with Mogilny on the plane.
The paperwork was filed and we were told to return to the U.S. Embassy in 24 hours, or thereabouts, to pick up a travel document, which we weren't certain we were going to get, because there still had to be a preliminary determination that he was in fact eligible to be considered a refugee or an asylee. I left the car and instructed Don Luce to drive around the area but not stop at or near the embassy. I would meet them at a prearranged spot.
I drove Alex around and he wanted to call his parents. You know, he'd been cut off, the phone had been cut off, and he wanted to call back. And so he went in, and the operator, I guess, got the number back again. But he said this time an operator came on, and it was different from the operator before in Russia. And he came out and he said, I think they know where we are.
By this time, we had some fear that Soviets may suspect Alex's jump and be watching the embassy.
Jerry came back from the consulate and said that things are in the works, but he's going to have to go back, I believe, the next day. He said that our lives were in danger because no hockey player defected from Russia before. There's no doubt that someone might be listening to the phone calls. They're international phone calls.
Well, one of the phone calls in Ben's office, and Jerry said Alex is interested. Alex is getting ready to come out. But Ben's eyes lit up, and he looked at me. shook his head. No. So after Jerry hung up, he said, you've got to make sure the next time you talk to Jerry, he knows no more names, or Donnie, no more names. We know who they're talking about. Those guys you see on television with the long jackets, they're real. They're listening. And if they happen to pick up on that name and can reference it to Alexander Mogilny, they're going to come looking.
We were, like a James Bond type person at times, because you're driving around a country you don't know very well, and you're always thinking somebody's looking at you or looking for you or trying to find you, and we didn't want them to know where we were, so we kept switching hotels. You had to hide out.
The travels around the countryside, the secret hotel rooms, it was like a spy novel.
Checked into the Hotel Prince Philip at 12:30. It was not too late for him to reconsider and return to the Soviet team in time for the morning departure for Moscow.
There were people looking for him. They kept making announcements in the hotel, and they were asking everybody, where he was, if he was in the hotel, and it was clear that this was a major confrontation.
These are events of first impression. You don't really plan them.
The team members or the monitors, mentors that the Russians always had with their Red Army team, if they found him, they would physically grab him and return him. I don't know what they might have done with Jerry and Don Luce, but I just knew it was not good.
We were staying out of sight because the consequences of being discovered by the Swedish authorities or even, security on the other side could have been dire.
Icon.
There's a lot of speculations. Has he been offered a contract, or has he been murdered or killed?
There was some accusation floating around that we kidnapped him.
What if somebody comes to the door, or what if they find the car, or they know where we are?
Did you know Alex wanted to leave?
Right before, we talked about a couple of times. He said, no, I still like to go. He asked me to go. I'm like, I'm not sure.
How did the team react to that?
Not very well. That I can say. When Alex left, it's been a few meetings with certain officials.
All Soviet players on the 1989 World Championship team were questioned by Soviet authorities after Mogilny's defection.
Young player, young brain, and he was born in Siberia, in Khabarovsk, it's far east. And it's easy to tell him, oh, you have a great future. Yes, he had great future. But he decided to live this way.
Mogilny's status in the Army complicated matters further.
He was an officer in the Red Army, playing on the Red Army team. And as such, he would have been seen as we would see any officer in the Army defecting or deserting. That was serious.
He left Army. He was a ranked lieutenant, and it was not good.
You're involved in this world event for the guy sneaking out of Russia to come and play hockey for the Buffalo Sabres.
A defection that is far from resolved.
We certainly didn't want to hang around anywhere where there'd be any media. We got to get a travel document, get him signed to or at least agreed to a contract, and plane reservations back to the United States, all in about 24 to 36 hours. The Soviet team left for Moscow, minus Mogilny. Alexander insisted that we call his team hotel to leave a message that he was staying. Alexander insisted that the Soviet embassy be notified. Shortly after, we received a call that our travel documents were ready and that we should proceed immediately to the U.S. Embassy. We booked the first flight available to New York.
The scariest part was when we were on our way to the airport. You start seeing things that maybe aren't there. I don't know. You think maybe a car's not supposed to be there, or you start looking for things.
Once he left the hotel in Stockholm, there was a point of no return.
We get to the airport real early, and we're on the first flight out of Stockholm for New York City. I go through first. I have no trouble getting through. Alex came next, which was the nervous part, because one of the reasons why we wanted to get out of town fast was the concern that because the Soviet team had already left for Moscow, that there would be an alarm set up for his whereabouts, whether it be by the local police or whatever security people they might have had. So we had to get through there, out of there early, and then Don came through last. We got through without any incident.
Once we were through, I recall them picking up a Swedish newspaper, and they were listing our names, and they had some of the hotels we had stayed at. So like somebody was doing something to know where we had been.
I don't know how that ever got out, because we weren't even on the plane yet, and there was this speculation that we were leaving with Mogilny to go to the United States. I know for a fact that if it had been one more day, we wouldn't got out of the country.
Wheels up. When that plane took off was the first time they could breathe, that they were on their way. Because I think had the Soviets known he was going to get on that plane, they would have stopped it.
The flight home was quiet and uneventful. But when we landed in New York, we realized the story had been leaked. The airport manager came and said, we need you to go out and meet the press. It's all over the media. We said, we've never had this many media people in the airport before, and they know about what's going on with your defecting hockey player.
All I can say is that he voluntarily decided to come to the United States. Is he still in the city, or is he going off to Miami? No comment about that.
When we landed JFK, they had a big press conference there, and I believe at the time was the most reporters ever at JFK Airport when Jerry met the press there.
Alexander Mogilny is in the country. A few minutes ago in New York City, and Alexander Mogilny is in the country. That's all I have to say.
This wasn't about the Buffalo Sabres and getting a hockey player. This was a world event.
Alexander Mogilny met for over an hour and a half with immigration officials in the office of District Director Ben Farrell.
Unexpected arrival of Alexander Mogilny was an addition they certainly hadn't anticipated.
Alexander Mogilny has yet to make
the latest tool for Buffalo sportscasters here, the English to Russian and Russian to English dictionary.
Что там говорят, что я думал только о себе.
I've heard that they write that I think only about myself.
Когда я закончу играть в хоккей, когда бы я закончил играть в хоккей в Советском Союзе.
Who was thinking about me when I finished playing hockey in the Soviet Union?
Once we were in Buffalo, we wanted to keep Mogilny's whereabouts private. We thought it was best for Mogilny to live with Don Luce and his wife Diane.
A gentleman came to the door one day, and he'd been asking questions at the local grocery store. You know, he said, Alex is here, and I'd like to talk to him, and he had a Russian accent.
Alex thought it might be KGB. He spoke English to me, and then he said something in Russian, and then I came into Alex and said, someone wants to see you, and he said, Nit, I do not want to talk to them.
Why would he show up here? Like nobody else knew he was here. Kind of got the feeling that maybe somebody was doing something.
The next issue we faced was making sure Mogilny could stay in the country.
We're here this afternoon to announce that Alexander Mogilny has filed a petition for political asylum.
He came over as a humanitarian parolee, and that was a 6-month time frame. And once he arrived, we started work on the asylum application, which was more rigorous, took more time, required an affidavit to be filed. It provided background information about who he was, and more importantly, what the consequences would be for him if he attempted to return to the Soviet Union.
And those consequences would be
7 years hard labor, which in essence meant a death sentence.
Soviet military officials announced the 20-year-old Army lieutenant had been charged with desertion.
Well, they had to do that. Couldn't be any other way.
Obviously, he's got courage. His long-term future in the U.S. was still in doubt, and we needed something. We looked to our owner, the late Seymour Knox III, who took it to the highest levels of the U.S. government.
As this thing dragged on, I knew that they were digging deep to try to figure out who can we contact, who knows who.
My dad had a great relationship with President Bush. He and President Bush had gone to college together at Yale, President Bush had been in a number of different roles, head of the CIA for a little while. He was he was vice president before he became president. He had all the connections. He knew all the people to call at that moment in time about what to do and what were the steps that you needed to go through to be able to bring a defector into America.
George Bush found the incident compelling. He felt sympathy for Alex, who wanted to be in a different situation.
It took several months, but finally Alex Mogilny was granted asylum in the United States.
You know, if that phone call to George Bush had not been made, if he had not gotten an asylum, then presumably he would have been deported.
He came over to me and said, "Am I free now?" And I said, "Yes, you're free." Imagine yourself, a 20-year-old athlete, making the decision to leave your home and family and seek your personal and athletic freedom in the United States. An act of courage and determination that would set the stage for many other elite Russian athletes to follow. I just had a sense that this was, in all respects, the right thing to do at that time.
Dissolution of the Soviet Union, the wall falling down, a tremendous historical time, and that was part of it.
Sometimes these things happen for a reason, in fact, that they're meant to be.
Several months later, when I was reassigned to a director in Rome, Italy, I had the privilege of accompanying the Attorney General to Moscow. One of the Soviet members of their delegation come up to me while I was still sitting at the table and asked me to convey his best wishes to Alex Mogilny.
How did you know?
They do their homework, I'm sure.